I think it's probably the only yarn I ever won a prize with but I can't go in yarns because this is a true story, and most yarns they won't on. It's a story. It's about a friend of mine at school. As I said, don't get the wrong impression, I'm not a Vietnam vet, but when I grew up, I was in the Air Force in 1967, so that was the time if you wore a uniform in town, people would sort of call names at you and things like that. You didn't wear a uniform around, and so it's called the greatest compliment I ever got. It's called a hell of a way to get your name on a bridge, and they realised this bridge had never been dedicated. So when they went to dedicate the bridge, they got the current Governor General up. He wasn't the current, he was the Chief Defence Force then. And I thought, I never saw got a copy of it because I'd written it about 20 years before. And I scrolled through on Google, and it came up on an American Vietnam veteran site. And it said, of all the stories to come out of Vietnam, this is the one that does it for me. And I thought, whoa, that's better than winning anything. In the town where I once lived, they built a bridge. They named that bridge the Private Ziggy Trzcinski Bridge. Private Ziggy Trzcinski was killed in Vietnam. That's a hell of a way to get your name on a bridge. On April the 25th, 1979, in the autumn chill of an Anzac dawn, I laid a wreath in Ziggy's memory at the National War Memorial in Canberra. As I stepped back to make my salute, I felt a small hand forage for warmth up the sleeve of my uniform jacket, and I gazed down into the dark eyes of Catherine, my 8-year-old daughter. I thought, sure I wasn't much older than you when Ziggy and I first met. We were a gang of migrant kids. Our parents arrived on these shores with nothing but their dreams. Our teacher, Miss Watts, said our parents were very wise because you brought nothing into this world and you took nothing out. Everything else was a gift from God. Miss Watts named our gang the Screaming Eagles. The money-saving crew cuts our parents gave us reminded her of World War II American paratroopers. Miss Watts wanted to be a nun, but Miss Watts had an illness. Miss Watts didn't want anyone to know that she was sick because she only took her medicine and she thought no one was looking. Miss Watts took so much medicine that she kept it in a sherry bottle. One week, when Miss Watts had not been to school for several days, we decided to pay her a visit. We didn't have any money for a get well gift, but Ziggy said if everything was a gift from God, that must include the flowers from the Bishop's garden. So that afternoon, we availed ourselves to the largest bunch of flowers we could carry on our bicycles and set off the 15 kilometres to Miss Watts' house. Miss Watts was very, very sick. There were 4 empty sherry flagons on the lounge room floor. When she saw the flowers, she cried and said she was going to put them on the church for Sunday Mass. As our Bishop's gardener was also the church warden, we decided that it may not be such a good idea. She said we shouldn't have travelled all that way. And Ziggy said the journey was part of the gift. Years later, I would recall those words. It was 1968, and Australia was at war in Southeast Asia. The Screaming Eagles had all joined the military forces. Ziggy joined the Army, Toot joined the Navy, Les and I joined the Air Force. On Saturday morning, I would hitchhike to the town of my future wife. In the early afternoon, I would hitchhike a ride back to base. It was a round trip of 640 kilometres. But while I pledged my life to the one I loved on the streets of Tamworth, Ziggy gave his life in South Vietnam for the country he loved. They brought Ziggy home, and we buried our eagle without fanfare. For in those days, a nation sent its young men and women to war, and when they returned, they abused them and daubed them with red paint. A woman called me a child killer. I was 17. As a child, I would rise on Anzac Dawn and watch ageing men march to the sound of a muffled drum, and the people said how they loved their country. Now, each Anzac Day, as I marched that same sombre beat, I asked if we loved our country any less. The night we buried Ziggy, the Screaming Eagles all met in the local RSL club, and an old man said how strange it was that the only local lad to be lost in Vietnam wasn't even born in Australia. And we said, we weren't even born here either. But what was strange, that 25 years before, our fathers were fighting each other. You see, before you can commit your love to the future, You have to absolve the hate of the past. But Ziggy did receive his hero's return. In 1987, Australia finally welcomed home the men and women she had sent to war 2 decades before. And as Ziggy's brother Bernard watched the 504 flag bearers march past, each flag representing an Australian life lost in Vietnam, he froze in disbelief, because there, carrying his own flag, was Ziggy, and he hadn't aged 1 day in 20 years. Bernard ran through the barricades calling his brother's name, and the 2 men embraced and marched on together. Many saw that as a gift, because Bernard had been crippled with polio since he was a child. But the greatest gift occurred 19 years before, when Ziggy came home on R&R and married his sweetheart, Charlene. And that night, Ziggy Jr. was conceived, and 20 years later, he carried his father's flag and the Vietnam Welcome Home Parade. Sometimes, in the chill of an Anzac dawn, I remember those days. You see, love is an immortal gift, and if you love someone or something and it dies, your love will sustain that memory. In 1991, Catherine, the little girl who had stood beside me that Anzac Day so many years before, joined the Air Force. One day, as she was driving to a base in Queensland, she passed through the town where I once lived. In the town of Maitland, New South Wales, they built a bridge, and they named that bridge the Private Ziggy Trzynski Bridge. As my daughter drove onto the bridge, one of her friends asked, "Who was Private Ziggy Trzynski?" And my daughter replied, "He was a friend of my dad's, and Private Ziggy Trzynski died in Vietnam." And her friend replied, "Well, that's a hell of a way to get your name on a bridge."
Whereabouts in Maitland? Whereabouts in Maitland is the...
Over the swamp. It's just coming up King Tubman Drive, up over the swamp, as you go up to Campbell's Hill, up to the hospital on the right hand side.
Yeah, all right.
That's the bridge. It's got a name plate on.
Yep.
Yeah, I've got to see those two.